Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
This is a fascinating trade that we're watching. The broad market, not so good today, but Nvidia is on fire. AMD's having a big day. This is a big day for artificial intelligence. And the companies that we talk about in this whole ecosystem, it's all coming together with an event that's being thrown together and endorsed by the White House here with a lot of other officials, both government officials and corporate officials. And we're going to bring you there live in just a moment. Thanks for being here on the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio, Satellite Radio, Channel 121. We're live on Bloomberg Originals. If you'd like to see what's happening, go to YouTube as well. Search Bloomberg Business News Live as we bring you our live stream here from the nation's capital throughout the day. The president in Pittsburgh here, along with a series of notables. Senator David McCormick is part of this. You keep hearing the number $70 billion. This is a collection of investments coming from the private sector here, Blackstone, CoreWeave. And it's not just to open data centers. It's about getting the power, the energy to drive them. And that's where we start our conversation this hour. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall has already made her way to Pittsburgh and is now at the big Pennsylvania Energy Summit with us right now as we look toward the future of artificial intelligence. Tyler, what's happening on the ground?
Yeah, hey, Joe. Well, we're waiting for President Trump to take the stage later on this afternoon. And as you mentioned there, he's expected to announce billions when it comes to investments in artificial intelligence, but also the energy infrastructure and actually the energy power that's needed in order to fuel it. And it's sort of difficult to pinpoint how much energy artificial intelligence actually uses because there's a bunch of different metrics that goes into it. But one thing is for sure, demand is surging and it's only expected to go up from here. A recent analysis from Goldman Sachs estimates that data center energy consumption is going to go up 160% by 2035. That then leaves us with questions on how is the U.S. going to meet that demand. And I actually sat down earlier with the U.S. Energy Secretary Christopher Wright, who told me it's going to be difficult, but that the administration is trying to prioritize this idea that their deregulation agenda is ultimately going to help spur more production. I will say an interesting sort of counter to this is that while the administration is of course very focused on this idea of drilling, drill, baby, drill, we hear a lot from them. I spoke to the American Petroleum Institute. Yes, they do represent the oil industry, but they actually told me that this might need to be a whole approach, a holistic approach, and include other energy sources like wind and solar, for example, because the consumption is just really going up from here, Joe.
That says a lot, Tyler, when the API is talking wind and solar. Tyler, we'll get back to you in a little bit as we stand by for the president's arrival at the Pennsylvania Innovation and Energy Summit. We've got our eyes, as I mentioned, on Nvidia. It's not just because of this summit that's going on. There's big news today that's been driving the stock price here sharply higher. AMD as well. Nvidia right now up over 4% or $7 to a new all-time high. We're in the $171 zone here for Nvidia, and it's not an accident, as you've been hearing on Bloomberg. Nvidia and AMD, its rival, have been cleared to resume some AI chip sales to China in a very important reversal here. Remembering we told you with the help of Mike Shepard that Jensen Huang was at the White House last week. We might have a better idea now of what they were talking about. A couple things I want to mention before we bring in Shep. Howard Lutnick on the other network right now saying that we're selling China our fourth best chip. These are not the Blackwells, right? These are the H20s that you've heard about that Nvidia will now be able to start selling to China again. Lutnick saying that we stay one step ahead of China so they continue to buy the chips, presumably that we want them to buy. Scott Besson also weighing in on trade talks with China. He was live on Bloomberg TV and radio earlier today. Here's what he said on Bloomberg Surveillance.
You might say that that was a negotiating chip that we used in Geneva and in London. It was all part of a mosaic. They had things we wanted, we had things they wanted, and we're in a very good place. I expect to meet my Chinese counterpart, the vice premier, in the next few weeks.
time to start stacking the chips, it sounds like. Michael Shepard has been all over this story for us, live in Washington, Bloomberg senior editor for technology and strategic industries. It's great to see you, Mike. Congratulations on all this coverage. You're the one who's been scooping this for us with a remarkable turn in this administration. What did Jensen Huang say to Donald Trump last week?
Well, we don't know. This was a conversation that took place in private between the two men who clearly, since the start of the administration, have built something of a rapport, Joe. It's funny, in Trump's public remarks where Jensen Huang has been present or at an event, or Trump has been asked about Nvidia and things like chips restrictions, he has singled out the CEO for lavish praise and really jumped onto the Nvidia bandwagon as a signal of what he sees as an American success story. In Saudi Arabia, he did a sort of a roll call of who was present, and he was looking for Jensen Huang in the audience and found him. Where's Jensen? Where's my friend Jensen? And he went on to praise some of the spending plans that Nvidia has to make $500 billion worth of its chips at these new TSMC plants that are being built in Arizona right now. So Jensen Huang is getting on the right side of Trump's attempt to reindustrialize the country, that part of the story. But the other part is Trump may have been more receptive as a result to Jensen Huang's other message, which is that, look, we need to be able to export these chips to markets, including China, because if we cede the China market, it is the largest for semiconductors in the world, mind you. If we cede that market, then Huawei will have free reign there. And then Huawei will be able to develop enough critical mass to be able to start selling some of those chips that compete with NVIDIA's to other markets abroad, in the Middle East, in Latin America, and in Africa. And Jensen Huang very much wants, and he's articulated this repeatedly, including to U.S. officials, that he wants to see AI develop globally on what he calls an American tech stack.
That's right.
Joe.
And I've heard you say that before, but I've never heard the argument quite the way that you just articulated it. It's not just that, what's good for America is good for the world. This is about an emboldened China, a strengthened Huawei that would have influence beyond our borders. So if they're buying Nvidia, you keep Huawei in check.
That is at least the theory as spelled out by Jensen Huang. Now, there are a lot of China hawks here in Washington, we've talked about for years, Joe, who have great concerns about this approach. They see that letting China and Chinese companies gain access to advanced technology like NVIDIA's, it poses a national security risk. And they see a great nexus between China's industrial complex and its military complex. And the fear is that these AI chips have a dual use potential, that they could be used for surveillance, for military purposes. And they see that as a risk. And they had applauded the previous ban on these H20 chips. Now, remember, the H20 chip had been tailored specifically by NVIDIA for the Chinese market to meet previous restrictions that the Biden administration had imposed. But the prior administration, and the new administration, the Trump administration, had grown concerned that maybe those restrictions weren't tough enough, and that China might be able to do something to either make gains in AI commercially or militarily. Hence, the move in February by Trump to crack down on H-20 sales in China. But now we're seeing a reversal. And Howard Lutnick kind of pointed to this. He was making the argument that, look, those H-20 chips are really kind of second or third tier. And we even heard David Sachs in an interview on BTech just in the past hour with our own Ed Ludlow make essentially that same case, Joe.
In our remaining moment here, we're talking about Jensen Huang and NVIDIA. This is a big deal for AMD as well. Be able to sell its MI308, if I'm saying it right,
That's
chip.
Right, you got it.
Does Lisa Su have Jensen Huang to thank, her big competitor for this?
Well, very much. I mean, Lisa Su, of course, has been trying to make her own case in inroads with the administration on this policy front. But really, the name that garners all the headlines and the chips that everybody around the world wants for AI, it's NVIDIA. They're
You've
the ones
picked
that
up one of
the
these
agenda.
H20 assemblies.
They're pretty heavy.
It's heavy, you told
70
me.
pounds.
70 pounds.
It's a good workout, Joe.
I bet that's true. It just makes you realize how difficult it is to move these things over there.
You don't need to go to the gym.
I bet that's right. With Mike Shepard, breaking news here today on Bloomberg as we watch shares of Nvidia leap higher, now $171, up over 4%. We'll keep tabs on this for you with another check on the markets coming up right here on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We want to talk about all of this with Anna Ashton, the founder of Ashton Analytics, a specialist in U.S.-China trade, which is why we bring her on so often, former China analyst with the Department of Defense. Anna, it's great to have you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm wondering your thoughts on this about face when it comes to chips from Nvidia and AMD. Is this in the best national security interest of America?
Well, I think it's important to note that not only are these not the only things that the Trump administration has recently rolled back in terms of export restrictions, but all of the things that they've rolled back so far are things that they themselves imposed this spring, either in April or in May. So when Treasury Secretary Bessent indicates that these were, chips that were part of the London negotiations, I take that at face value. They imposed more restrictions on exports of certain goods that they believed to be strategic for China in order to have bargaining power to try to get China to speed up its exports of rare earths.
Well, so when you talk about the walkbacks we've seen from this administration on various fronts when it comes to China, how much of a dovish turn would you characterize it as, Anna? And if it is indeed a dovish turn, how upset do you think China hawks in and around the administration and elsewhere are about these moves?
Well, look, I definitely think that China hawks are going to be upset, regardless of whether the rollbacks are of restrictions that were imposed recently by the Trump administration or of previously imposed restrictions. Because from a China hawk perspective, none of this technology should be going to China at all. But I also think that in terms of trying to measure whether or not this is a dovish turn by the Trump administration, we still have to wait and see. Because at the end of the day, this will only be a truly substantive change in U.S. policy towards China when it comes to export controls and access to critical U.S. technologies if we see a rollback in Biden-era export controls. I certainly think that that is something that China wants. And it may be, it's possible China will get something like that. Because we know that rare earth exports have, the licensing approvals have picked up, and there's some evidence to indicate that shipments are beginning to flow more smoothly. But certainly there's no approval of anything to go to military end users, for example. Things could always be faster than they already are, and they're not as fast as they were prior to these restrictions on exports of Chinese rare earths and magnets being imposed. So we'll have to see whether or not the Trump administration is willing to give ground on any Biden-era policies.
Well, do you worry more about the next DeepSeek emerging, or do you go back to your role at the Department of Defense and worry about what China might do with this technology when it comes to building weapons?
I think that whether or not China gets this technology from the U.S., I think that this buys China time to continue developing indigenous technologies without losing the ability to apply these technologies in various ways that are important for them in the near term. But China has been throwing enormous amounts of money towards indigenous development of its own technologies so that it won't have to rely on the United States anymore. It's been doing that for a number of years now, and it's been doubling and tripling down on that. I think it's only a matter of time before China doesn't need U.S. technologies in order to accomplish the various ends that it's trying to accomplish. And so that's happening regardless.
Well, speaking of matters of time, Anna, we just heard from the Treasury Secretary moments ago suggesting that August 12th should not be viewed by market participants as a deadline they should be worried about. Does that suggest to you that there is a lack of forward progress in reaching more of a trade agreement between the U.S. and China? Should we consider any of these deadlines to be real at this point?
super fair question. It does suggest to me that they have yet to make it past serious discussion, make it to serious discussion of things beyond rare earths. I feel like rare earths has been the hair on fire crisis for the Trump administration, particularly because of the heavy rare earth magnets that are so important not only to electric vehicles, but also to traditional combustion engine vehicles and to so many electronics. And I think that, that will continue to be something that China can use as leverage to get the U.S. to the table. And until that is satisfactorily resolved in the U.S. mind, it will be hard to move forward on negotiation of other issues. I think it is worth noting that a couple of key heavy rare earths that are used in these magnets that have been in short supply, like dysprosium, for example, and neodymium, those also are not, they're primarily sourced from Myanmar. And the state in Myanmar that they're primarily sourced from has been incredibly unstable due to domestic conflict for the past six to 8 months. And China itself is having a hard time getting these things. So it's just worth keeping in mind that China is not necessarily simply using these rare earth export licensing restrictions to gain leverage vis-a-vis the U.S. It is also thinking about its own supply security. And that may limit how much it can negotiate.
Do you want to see President Trump, President Xi in the same room? Do you want to see a summit? And is that, in fact, where the president might be most likely to give up the ghost on this and lower export controls, to your point, from the Biden administration?
From the perspective of somebody who would like to see a more functional and healthy U.S.-China relationship, that sounds like a really nice thing. When I'm thinking about it in terms of strict U.S. interests, there are things that could certainly be gained there. If I put on my China hawk hat and look at it through the lens of security concerns, these are really difficult trade-offs. And a meeting that caused President Trump to relax export controls, bigger, more fundamental export controls on advanced technologies to China might not be in the U.S. interest.
Anna, we learned from President Trump yesterday that if no ceasefire agreement is reached between Russia and Ukraine within 50 days, that he will look to impose 100% what he described as secondary tariffs on countries that help Russia, including big buyers of Russian oil. Read China. How do you expect Beijing would respond if indeed something like that were implemented? Would their behavior be, okay, we're going to stop buying cheap Russian crude and exports, or we're going to potentially retaliate against the U.S. with tariffs in kind?
China certainly can't stop buying Russian crude or gas. And that's because it gets an even bigger percentage from Russia than it did before the Ukraine war started. And it's pretty heavily reliant on Russia. Russia is one of its main suppliers. So that's not in the cards. What is potentially in the cards is use of smaller companies instead of their main oil and gas companies, which is already to a large extent the case, to move that oil and gas and therefore sort of shield China's broader economy from any secondary sanctions that are imposed. If the secondary sanctions don't hit the big banks that are, if the big banks aren't processing these transactions, then, China can kind of prevent calamity from ensuing as a result of the sanctions. And we've seen them do that with their purchases from Iran as well. That's what I would expect that to be their first move.
Well, so Anna, if I read you correctly, if China's not going to be able to actually adjust its purchases of Russian oil, would that mean that these secondary sanctions, tariffs, whatever you want to call them, would not have the intended effect the president wants here, which is to put the squeeze on the Russian economy and stop them from being able to fund their war machine?
I don't think that they would have the intended effect, because I think that, I mean, other countries that are buying from Russia might not have the same safeguards in place to protect them from secondary sanctions, but China certainly has safeguards in place, and China is the biggest buyer. So, I think that we've been learning the hard way for a few years now that there are limits to the power of U.S. sanctions, and they don't always achieve what we hope that they will achieve. And I don't think that secondary sanctions on all sales of Russian oil are necessarily going to achieve what Trump wants.
All right, Anna, we appreciate you joining us. As always, Anna Ashton is founder of Ashton Analytics.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
China looming large today in testimony on Capitol Hill. Michael Waltz. Yes, that Michael Waltz on Capitol Hill today. The president's former national security advisor, who I won't say was fired, but removed from that job. And it all followed the whole signal scandal that you might remember. Michael Waltz is now the president's nominee for ambassador to the United Nations, and that is the reason why he was on Capitol Hill today, a confirmation hearing to be the U.S. ambassador to the UN. But everybody said when this was announced that how could he survive such a blistering hearing? The likes of Chris Coons, Tim Kaine, and other Democrats were going to speak truth to power here, delve into the signal scandal that, of course, included revealing military attack plans, airstrikes, the timing and method of the airstrikes that would be used against Houthi rebels. It was Mike Waltz that added a journalist from The Atlantic to that signal chat that also included the Secretary of Defense and the Vice President of the United States. I don't have to replay this whole thing to you. This has been a coiled spring for some time. We thought there'd be fireworks popping off in the hearing. The aforementioned Chris Coons, Democrat from Delaware, did tangle with Michael Waltz on this. Let's listen.
You were sharing details about an upcoming airstrike and the time of launch and the potential targets. I mean, this was demonstrably sensitive information. And the question I asked was, were you investigated for this expansion of the signal group to include a journalist?
The White House conducted an investigation, and my understanding is the Department of Defense is still conducting an investigation.
Was any disciplinary action taken?
From the White House Investigation Center?
Yes.
No, the use of signal was not only authorized, it's still authorized and highly recommended.
Not only authorized, but highly recommended. That was kind of it. Tim Kaine had one question for him. Democrats seem to have given up the ghost on this whole scandal, and maybe he will, in fact, be the next U.S. ambassador to the UN. We assemble our political panel for their take on this and a lot more. Jeannie Shanzano is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor, senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. And Maura Gillespie is back, our Republican strategist, founder, Blue Stack Strategies, a veteran of John Boehner's Speaker's office in the House of Representatives. Great to see you both. Welcome back. Of course, Jeannie, did Democrats forget what a big deal this was a couple of months ago? What happened today?
Yeah, it was about an hour in before we even got those questions about Signalgate that we just heard from Chris Coons. They were focused on other issues that are critically important. Most importantly, of course, our relationship with China. So that is critically important. They talked about Israel, but they did wait a long time. And not only were there only a few questions about Signalgate, but interestingly, Senator Cory Booker didn't even ask any questions. He just expressed his deep disappointment. He's not going to support Waltz. And that was it. So I think we expected a little bit more of them to take up the opportunity to make some points for those all-important campaign commercials in 26. They didn't use this opportunity that way. So
what's the lesson here, Maura? Time heals all scandals? because this was an outrage. It was the biggest story in the world when this broke. The screen grabs of that Signal chat had us talking for weeks. And today, this is what we got.
I am a little surprised at the lack of questioning around, did Mike Waltz know where Steve Witkoff was on that message chain? Sure, of course, obviously the big question about the adding a reporter to a chain. But I had concerns about the fact that Steve Witkoff was in Russia and these conversations were happening. And so that was one of my concerns, and I'm surprised that wasn't necessarily brought up. But I think what the takeaway here is that Mike Waltz isn't the target. Pete Hegseth was the one that was putting out the line-by-line war plans, and Pete Hegseth seems to be the target, I think, for Democrats. If they wanted to have, advertisements against a Trump administration official in the future, that's going to be somebody who they could actually galvanize their base and their voters to realize is a threat. Mike Waltz is a decorated war veteran. He has had administration experience, so I don't think that he's necessarily the person that they need to be going after in that regards.
Well, look, it's interesting here. If China is, in fact, the main topic for Democrats, Jeannie, that is what they spent the most time on. Do Democrats trust Mike Waltz in this position to counter China? He talked about going up against China as absolutely critical. China pushes its personnel into roles at all levels, including bodies that set international standards. He says it's absurd that China continues to be treated as a developing nation. These are ideas that Democrats agree with, correct?
They are. And, when I was listening to the testimony, I was thinking back to your really a good conversation yesterday with Senator Jeanne Shaheen. And she made a point then, and she made it again today during the hearing, which is that the administration's approach to China, despite all the rhetoric, is incoherent. And she points to several things, but one thing of the moment is that while this hearing is going on, we are on the verge of a vote on the rescissions package, which would destroy U.S. aid. And what China is doing so well right now is something the United States used to do, which is the exercise of soft power and diplomatic application of pressure and not tariffing our friends and allies. And so Senator Shaheen, both to you and Kailey yesterday, and importantly in the hearing today, made this point. And, Mike Waltz had very little to come back with on any of those points or the minority report released, which is the fact that the administration's approach to China is scattered. And that's my word, not Senator Shaheen's. It is scattered. And they're running in several directions at the same time. And I think that was reiterated more strongly today by Mike Waltz's inability to respond to her than anything else I've heard recently.
That's really interesting, Maura, when you consider the cuts that have come to USAID that are included in this rescissions package, the ability for America to wage the information war to try to influence people outside of our borders. Does Jeannie have a point on this?
Absolutely. And I do think that Mike Waltz is in a precarious position because he does obviously feel as though he's kind of on the chopping block still with the Trump administration after the Signalgate fallout. So how forward he'd be about his position on the role of USAID. And truthfully, I think for many Americans and those in leadership and those who have had administration experience, they recognize that our USAID and foreign aid is a diplomacy tool. And they could, put that under the umbrella of the Secretary of State and use it as a diplomacy tool because it is. It helps us, like Jeanine said, like soft power, right? But what Mike Waltz has to do, he has a delicate dance to do here because he doesn't want to go out publicly and speak out saying something that's maybe contrary to what the Trump administration wants to say. But he knows the important role that America plays in the world. And so I do have confidence that he knows that. How much he can do currently, but it's hard to say. But for these next few years, he could do, I have more confidence in that.
Well, Jeannie, you wonder if some of the Democrats in that hearing room today should have listened to Barack Obama, or maybe they were listening. His comments at this fundraiser the other night, pretty remarkable. This was a fundraiser, a closed-door fundraiser, as these things go, that was put together at the home of Governor Phil Murphy of New Jersey, a DNC fundraiser, where the president said it's going to require, the former president, a little less navel-gazing and a little less whining and being in the fetal position. He's telling Democrats to toughen up, Jeannie. And he went on to say that when he was president, Progressives, liberals stood for all kinds of stuff, who seem like they're kind of now cowed and intimidated and shrinking away from just asserting what they believe. Is that what we witnessed today in the hearing?
I don't think so. I understand what the former president is trying to do. He was particularly tough in those comments on elite institutions, those outside of traditional power in Congress, running the elite law firms and the elite universities and others. He didn't mention some by name, but clearly that was on his mind in terms of their stepping back, accepting, assuaging Donald Trump's attacks on them, the media as well. He was less, I think, tough on some of those in elected office. So I'm not sure he was their primary target, but he is trying to energize the base. And the timing here is very interesting because we have an election today, which is going to tell us a lot. For a House seat of a member who passed away, we have it's going to be in Arizona's 7th district, and you've got a split there amongst progressives. And what's so interesting about this is you've got some of the progressives like Bernie Sanders on one side, and you've got some of the other ones on the other side who are of the younger, I would say, David Hogg variety, who have made their case for a more robust pushing back. And I think for people in Congress, those are the kind of debates we're seeing, not to mention my very own New York City, where we have a very progressive Mamdani versus a still Representative Adams and former Governor Cuomo. So Democrats are trying to iron this out at this point.
I'm glad you mentioned that special primary today in Arizona. It is something that we're going to be watching, Jeannie, as Democrats choose their nominee to succeed Raul Grijalva. There's also new polling out today, Maura, from the Fabrizio group here, Tony Fabrizio and Bob Ward, that is not good news for Republicans on the midterm campaign trail. Republicans trailing on the generic ballot here in a survey of 28 battleground House seats, including 15 where Republicans won in 2024 by 5 points or less, and 13 won by both the Democratic House candidate and Trump. Among those most motivated to vote, an early indication of vote likelihood in the midterms, the Republican is down 7 points. How do you turn that around between now and the midterms, Maura?
Well, it's interesting because Republicans will have to decide what benefit they get from staying in line and supporting Trump's message. If he can galvanize his voters to come out, there's a big fracture right now amongst his own base. And so how much do they play up their allegiance to Donald Trump, or how much do they focus more on the district themselves, the constituents? We know that midterms typically produce a lower turnout. It's not necessarily news. That's pretty, unfortunately, the standard. People just don't turn out for midterms like they do in a general election and when there's a presidential. But that being said, these members do need, given the fact that the House is such a thin majority, it has been projected that Democrats will take the gavel. And with the one big beautiful bill, that messaging, Democrats are probably ripe to go ahead and campaign on that because of its low approval ratings. But again, I think the big question for Republicans running for re-election is to decide, do I stick with Trump and tout my allegiance, or do I focus more on the people who I represent, who I'm supposed to be serving here, and talk about the issues that matter most to them, and less focus on a president who's a lame duck?
Maura Gillespie and Jeannie Shanzano. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.